So my name is Gabriel Lear. I'm a member of the philosophy department and also of the Committee on Social Thought. And I wanted to talk to you all today about Plato's views of philosophical wonder. So, I've been doing philosophy for decades now, but there's a question, how do people get into doing philosophy? I mean, philosophers like to say that human beings are by nature philosophical, but in fact, what is it that starts you onto the activity of philosophy? Well, one reason that Plato is such an extraordinarily important figure in the history of Western philosophy is not only that his ideas and questions are ones that continue to be discussed and thought about, but also because he wrote dialogues with the figure of Socrates in them, so that we don't only hear about philosophical ideas, but we also get to see or read about a model philosopher. And so that is part of why Plato has been so influential, is that he's influenced our sense of just what it means to be a philosopher. So what does Socrates do? Well, he goes around refuting people. He goes up to people who have some pretense to being wise about something. Say he goes up to the priest Euthyphro and asks him, what is piety? And he thinks he knows what he's talking about, and so he gives an answer, and Socrates shows him that that's wrong, and he tries to give another answer, and Socrates shows him that that's wrong. And you might think, Socrates is trying to incite Euthyphro into a life of philosophy, but it doesn't work, right? Euthyphro gets very frustrated with Socrates and says, look, I'm busy, I gotta go. And so, it's what is it that Socrates thinks he's doing that's actually going to sort of get people onto a philosophical path? And so this is a reason that the dialogue Theaetetus is interesting. And this is the first item on your handout. I hope you all have a handout here. So Socrates and Theaetetus have just been talking about some puzzles. Like, Socrates says, how is it that I haven't changed at all, and yet I used to be taller than you, and now I'm shorter than you, but I haven't changed? Isn't that sort of weird, right? And one of my teachers, Harry Frankfurt, said that the only thing puzzling here is that Socrates is puzzled by this. But let's leave that aside as to whether or not you're actually puzzled by this puzzle. This is, Socrates says here, you follow me, I take it, Theaetetus. I think you must be familiar with this kind of puzzle. And Theaetetus responds, oh yes, indeed, Socrates. I often wonder like mad what these things can mean. Sometimes when I'm looking at them, I begin to feel quite giddy. Socrates says, I dare say you do, my boy. It seems that Theodorus was not far from the truth when he guessed at what kind of person you are. For this is the experience which is characteristic of a philosopher. This wondering, this is where philosophy begins and nowhere else. And the man who made Iris, the rainbow, the child of Thaumas, wonder, was perhaps no bad genealogist. The idea there is that wonder is the rainbow that takes you into the divine. So the important thing to see here is that unlike Socrates' encounters with these people who purport to be wise, Theaetetus, when he gets into this experience of being refuted, doesn't just feel frustrated or doesn't just feel like he has nowhere to go. He feels a sense of wonder, thauma, and that is the thing that marks him as a philosopher. That's the thing that sets him off onto the philosophical life. So one question then is, well, what is this experience of wonder that Socrates is talking about? And Aristotle, who is Plato's most famous pupil, has his own interpretation of this. And this is the second item on your handout. This comes from the Metaphysics. Aristotle says, the person who is puzzled and wondering thinks he is ignorant, with the result that people in the past philosophized because they were fleeing ignorance. All people begin, as we said, by wondering that the matter is so, as in the case of automatic marionettes, or the solstices, or the incommensurability of the diagonal of a square with the side. For it seems wonderful to all people who have not yet contemplated the cause that there is a thing which cannot be measured by even the smallest unit. But we must end in the contrary, and as the proverb goes, the better state. just as happens in these cases when people learn. For there is nothing which would astonish, which would make someone wonder, a geometer, so much as if the diagonal turned out to be commensurable. So here are a few things I want you to notice about Aristotle's interpretation. It seems that he thinks of wonder as a kind of curiosity, right? It's a little bit painful. It's the sense of your own ignorance, but with the concomitant desire to find out the answer. Right? So it's a kind of curiosity. And what that means for Aristotle is that when you actually know the thing that you are currently ignorant of, when you come to know it, you will no longer wonder. So in his view, the philosophical life begins in wonder, but ends by transcending wonder. And this is a view that has always felt to me not quite right. And I think his own examples give one sense of why it is that this doesn't feel quite right to me. He talks about marionettes. That's true, you see some kind of clever marionette or machine and you might think, oh, how did they do that? And you're curious. And then when you figure it out, there's nothing left to wonder about anymore. Now you know, but also, who cares? Why keep thinking about it? Right? It seems like once the trick has been discovered, then you've got to go on to something new. And now Aristotle himself would have a response to this. He thinks that the things that philosophy tries to understand are themselves inherently valuable, so that once you come to know them, you're going to want to keep contemplating them because, after all, they are the best things in the cosmos. But that makes the pleasure of sort of contemplating what we already know quite distinct from the pleasure of inquiry. Right? The pleasure of inquiry is the pleasure of wondering and figuring something out, and the pleasure of knowing will then be something that transcends wonder and is something altogether different. I see some students of mine who've taken Aristotle with me, and they know that Aristotle thinks that the best thing a human being can do is contemplate truths that he already knows. But to us, mere mortals, isn't it the pleasure of inquiry that's the wonderful thing, right? The sort of Aristotle's vision of the philosophical life is so remote from our own experience of inquiry and the pleasures that it has. So this is, I think, a problem with Aristotle's conception of wonder, that because he thinks of it as a kind of curiosity, he thinks that the sort of driver of inquiry is something altogether other than the sort of value and pleasure in actually understanding something and continuing to think about what you understand. And so, although Aristotle thought we should keep on contemplating the things we know, I think the far more familiar vision of, academic life is that first you figure out one thing, now you've got that done. Go on to something new, figure out something new. And there is this vision that the sort of successful philosopher or successful knower is always on the lookout for a new problem and always trying to discover something new. And that just could not be more antithetical to the ancient conception of what the philosophical life is like. So this is number 3 on your handout. This is what Socrates says in the Symposium. He is describing the so-called ladder of love, how somebody, if they're sort of fall in love with beautiful things in the proper order, will eventually come to see the forms, which are explanatory principles of everything. And he says, I tell you that whoever loves and contemplates various beautiful things in the proper order will suddenly catch sight of a beauty amazing in its nature, a beauty that always is and neither comes into being nor perishes, so on and so forth, skipping down to the bottom. It is here, if anywhere, my dear Socrates, that life is worth living for a human being, in contemplation of beauty itself. Right? So this is a very different vision, that we begin in wonder and we end still wondering, in sort of this fascination and awe. It's not something that we try to transcend. So I wanted today to just look a little bit more closely into how it is that Plato comes up with this conception of wonder, I think that it's important to see that Plato is drawing on his own culture and a sort of tradition of thinking about wondering. And there are lots of places that you can find this and all kinds of poets, but I'm going to focus on Homer, since Homer is always in the background as somebody that he's deeply indebted to, but also struggling against. Right. So the first item here, number 4 on the handout, I almost took at random. It's from the famous scene in the Iliad where Priam has managed to get into the camp of the Achaeans, into Achilles' camp, and suddenly Priam and Achilles are looking at each other. Priam, son of Dardanus, gazed at Achilles, marveling now at the man's beauty, his magnificent build. Face to face, he seemed a deathless god. So one thing to notice is the connection between wondering and seeing that happens here. This is pervasive in the poetic corpus. In fact, the verb thaumazein is so closely associated with seeing that some scholars have argued it actually is a verb of vision. So that the right way to translate it would be either seeing with wonder or wondering at seeing. That you can't really disentangle those two. And that's important because it suggests that wonder, thauma, this phenomenon that the Greeks are getting at with that word, is not just a subjective condition. Right? It's not just an interior feeling of excitement. It is like seeing, where seeing is veridical. If you actually see something, there is something there that you are seeing. So to wonder, at least in the Iliad, is actually to be encountering something, not just to have a sort of subjective experience. The other thing that you can see in this quotation is that the reason Achilles is so marvelous to behold is that he seems like a deathless god. And that also is pervasive in the poetic corpus, that when people wonder, it's because they feel that something divine has manifested itself to them. So they're seeing something, some divine presence. But, I mean, look, anytime, I guess if you ever did see a god, that would be astonishing, right? So this may go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Part of what's astonishing is that it's out of place, right? Part of what's astonishing about seeing the divine is that after all, you are a mortal in the mortal world. And so suddenly, so that thauma carries a connotation of surprise with it. You are surprised because you have encountered the divine in a mortal place where you don't expect it to be. And then, so that's, so that we've got the idea that thauma is a kind of vision. Thauma is an encounter with the divine. It is surprising. And then a fourth feature is that it involves a sense of paradox. So that sense that the divine, the immortal is in a mortal place. And even in more prosaic uses of the word thauma, you see that sense of paradox. So actually, at the beginning of the Theaetetus, there's a case like this, where Socrates has just come back from war, and he's asking, how's everybody doing? And they say, oh, we heard that Theaetetus behaved very bravely. And they say, oh, that's no thauma. What would have been a thauma is if he had not behaved bravely. So the thauma always involves a kind of unexpected paradox. Okay, so that is how it occurs in Homer. Just to take another couple of cases here, here's one from the Odyssey. Here they are looking at a brooch that's been crafted by Hephaestus, and this is the description. The front part of it was artful. A hound held a dappled fawn in his forepaws, preying on it as it struggled, and all were amazed. how though they were golden, it preyed on the fawn and strangled it. And the fawn struggled with his feet as he tried to escape. This is a passage actually that one of my colleagues in the art history department has really had a lot of interesting things to say about, Richard Lear. And what he points out is that, look, we do have this sense of paradox. This is golden, and yet the creatures on it seem to be moving, right? It's inert, and yet it seems to move. And that's the thing that is such a wonder about it. But I want to add to it, it's not just a sense of paradox, but it's the sense that there's something vital in a place that is dead. Right? There's a sense of a heightened being in a place that you don't expect to find it in the Brooch. And then one more from the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. Aphrodite is trying to disguise herself so that she doesn't terrify Anchises, but she can't help but manifest her divinity. Now when Anchises saw her, he marked well and wondered at her appearance and height and shining garments. For she was clad in a robe outshining the brightness of fire, splendid, golden, all adorned, which shimmered like the moon over her breasts, soft to the touch, a wonder to behold. All right, so again, there's a sense that she's wearing the clothes of a maiden, but they're shimmering with a kind of radiance that manifests her divinity to Anchises. Okay. Now, I had been looking at these passages, and what got me so excited is to realize this is exactly the way Plato describes the lover's encounter with a beautiful boy or any beautiful beloved. This is number 9 on your handout from the Phaedrus. Socrates has claimed that human souls are immortal, that at a certain point we fall into bodies and forget what it was that we had seen when we were disembodied. And he says, a recent initiate, one who has seen much in heaven, when he sees a godlike face or bodily form that has captured beauty well, first he shudders and a fear comes over him like those he felt at an earlier time. Then he gazes at him with the reverence due a god. And if he weren't afraid people would think him completely mad, he'd even sacrifice to his boy as if he were the statue of a god. Right? Remember, statues of gods are not the gods themselves, but somehow seem to have a divine presence in them. And you might think of Plato's theory of forms as a metaphysical theory that's meant to make good this experience of wonder. Plato thinks that all things in the sensible world are participating in a more perfect reality, so that to the degree that we are beautiful or good or just or anything, to the degree that we know anything, we are participating in a kind of being that transcends us. So if you recognize that in somebody, you would wonder. It would be astonishing because you would be sort of sensing in them a being that is more perfect than what they as mortal, finite creatures actually are. So I think that Plato's metaphysics of forms is intended to give an account of what this experience of wonder is about that does away with the Homeric gods, but still holds on to these 4 features, that when the lover wonders at the beautiful boy, he's actually seeing something divine in this other person, and it seems paradoxical and surprising, right? And it's that experience that leads the person into philosophy, Socrates says. And the reason that you're led into philosophy is that you have actually seen something that's extraordinarily valuable, though you do not yet know it. Right? So wonder is the experience not just of recognizing that you're ignorant, but actually seeing the thing that you want to know. And so the pleasure of inquiry is the pleasure of coming more and more fully to see this thing whose sort of extraordinary quality hit you at the beginning. But then once you have wisdom, it's still going to be wonderful, right? It's still going to be something somehow other than you and very valuable that you are, in this surprising way, capable of making some contact with. Plato's ethics of the philosophical life is, I think, one full of deep gratitude and optimism that though we are finite and kind of weak, lo and behold, we actually can know something. And that's extraordinary, that we actually, for all of our faults and flaws, can come in contact with the sort of principles of the universe, right? And that so that the wonder that we first feel when we realize, I thought I understood this, but I don't, is the very same wonder that's going to sustain us throughout our inquiry and into a continuing life of thinking about the cosmos, even after we know it as well as we possibly can. Okay, so that sounds great, you might think. And so you might think, okay, philosophical life is, or practice is a practice of talking. So you might think the point of talking is to elicit wonder, right? To, I'm trying to make you full of wonder. If, you're students in my class, you would try to make me feel full of wonder. And there's a sense in which Plato does describe it like that. So this is number 10 on the handout. This is Alcibiades in the Symposium, a notorious companion of Socrates. He says, I don't know if any one of you has seen the statues inside Socrates, but I did once see them, and they appeared to be so divine, golden, so outstandingly beautiful and amazing that I had to do whatever Socrates told me to do. Now, Alcibiades says a bit later that these golden statues are Socrates' words. It's his words that are so astonishing. And Alcibiades says he had to do whatever Socrates told him. Well, not quite. Reading on to passage 11, whenever I hear Socrates' words, I'm in the same state as the Corybantes. He's full of a kind of divine, he's possessed, right? Divine enthusiasm. Only much worse. Because of this Marcius, this one here, I was frequently reduced to thinking that it wasn't worth living my life in the condition that I'm in. What's more, even now I'm conscious that if I were prepared to listen to him, I wouldn't be able to resist, and the same things would happen to me. So I forcibly stop up my ears and I'm off, as it were running away from the sirens, to prevent my sitting there and growing old beside him. Now, what I love about Plato's depiction of Alcibiades is that Plato has already thought of the cynical objection, right, that we might have to this idea that philosophy begins in wonder. First of all, so if somebody speaks in such a way that makes you feel full of wonder, does that mean you're just going to do whatever they say? Is that really, this sounds like a kind of, cultish guru that he's talking about. So that's one worry that you might have about this way of vision of philosophical wonder, is that it doesn't, in fact, incite a life of genuine inquiry. It sort of encourages people to mystify themselves and take pleasure in a sort of mystification and kind of cultish illusion. That's one aspect of what Alcibiades says. And another one is that Alcibiades doesn't want to hear it. If you really have an encounter with the divine, that's scary. It's not just pleasant, it's terrifying. And you notice that when Anchises sees Aphrodite, she's big. Homeric gods are tall, large, strong, glimmering in their aura. It's not just pleasant. And so I think it's good to see Socrates realize, Plato realize that even if wonder is a genuine encounter with some very valuable thing in the world, that doesn't settle the question of how we'll react to that. And that is why he thinks it's so important to have a teacher. That's why he thinks it's important to have a whole institution and a practice around it to help you respond well to the experience of wonder in one way or other. So, but going back to this question about the sort of cultish wonder working, does Plato have a way of distinguishing the wonder of philosophical speech from the sort of sophistical wonder working that isn't genuinely concerned with illumination, but is only concerned with the feeling of being illuminated without actually being illuminated? This is something that I'm trying to figure out right now. So my thoughts about this are not as complete as I wish they were. Maybe you all can help me. But one thing that I want to point out to you is the way in which Plato flips the Homeric tradition of wonder. So I pointed out in these passages from Homer, I pointed out in a couple of places the word poikilos, pampoikilos, pantoian, the idea that, you know, when you see something wonderful, Homer thinks that the thing about it that seems wonderful is its variety. It's the sort of multiplicity of the divine revelation that marks it as divine. And I think you can see something in that, I hope you can see something in that that's attractive. It seems kind of prosaic if somebody is just, if somebody is just showing themselves as they are and it's just one single thing, right? I don't know if any of you all heard, there was Mark Strand gave a reading last week in which he read a couple of poems or there's one in particular where a husband and wife confront each other and the husband says to the wife, "I'm not everything that you see, I'm so much more." And she says, "Thank goodness." Basically, I know, she's like, "I trust you are more than what I see," right? And that sense that we want to be more than the single unitary thing we are, I think captures this sense that if you really encounter the divine, there would not be a single voice that could fully capture it. There wouldn't be a single appearance that would fully capture it. The divine being exceeds all boundaries. Plato hated this thought. It's totally wrong for him because the forms are one thing. Each of them is one thing. It is the form of courage is the one thing that all courageous actions participate in. And it's the one thing they have in common. So Plato agrees with Homer in thinking that wonderful things present us with a paradoxical juxtaposition of multiplicity and unity. Right? The fawn, sort of in its dappled and movement, on the brooch, is sort of looking multifarious, even though it's somehow one thing. Plato agrees that wonderful things are like that, but whereas Homer invites us to find the divinity in the multiplicity, Plato invites us to find the divinity in the unity. He says what's really astonishing is that in our world that's full of so many different things, so many different experiences, so many different perspectives on the world, nevertheless, there is one thing that shines through, and that's the truth. Another way of putting this is to say that truth is consistent and unitary and eternal. Right? And it's that one thing that strikes out. So I want to suggest that the way Plato would distinguish sophistical wonder working from genuine philosophical wonder is that sophistical wonder working gets us excited with a lot of multiplicity, but philosophical wonder keeps bringing us back to the same thing over and over again, that you have that sense of hearing the voice of truth Because no matter what perspective you try to take on your question, you still find that the truth is the same. That's what is so wonderful. And so I want to close with this final quotation where Socrates, somewhat ironically, is talking about how wonderful Agathon's speech was in praise of love. But he says, of course, nothing in that speech was true. Right? And he says, "Oh, do you think that I was foolish to fear the fear that I felt before, and that I wasn't being prophetic when I said what I was saying just now, that Agathon would speak amazingly well and leave me at a loss? How am I not going to be at a loss, I or anyone else, if he were going to speak after a speech delivered with such beauty and variety? The other parts may not have been so wonderful, but that at the end, who would not be astonished on hearing the beauty of the words and phrases? Anyway, I was worried I'd not be able to say anything that came close to them in beauty. And so I would almost have run away and escaped." Here the sort of foreshadowing of Alcibiades, who wants to run away and escape from Socrates. "I would almost have run away and escaped if there had been a place to go. And you see, the speech reminded me of Gorgias, so that I actually experienced what Homer describes. I was afraid that Agathon would end up by sending the Gorgian head, Medusa, monstrously clever at speaking in a speech against my speech, and this would turn me to stone." Now, Medusa's head is many-headed, right? It's covered in snakes. But more to the point, it's also many-voiced. And this is number 7 on your handout, a line from Hesiod's Theogony, where he describes that. And I won't read that through, but the point is that this typho, this gorgon, is full of many voices. Right? No single voice captures or fully manifests this horrible creature. And that is what the sophistical, wonder-working, truth-indifferent speech is like. You hear many different voices in it. There's a kind of glorying in many different voices. By contrast, Socrates says that he will elicit wonder by showing you that things are necessarily the way he says they are. And that is something that comes up later in his own speech in praise of love. He says that, isn't it true that it is necessarily like this? I want to say that sense of necessity that a philosophical argument can give you is that sense of hearing the one voice of reality, constraining what it is that you are capable of saying. Right? So it's that sense of unity. Okay, I want to give you all time to ask questions. I know this was sort of a quick survey, but I just want to end by saying, sort of, if we believe Plato about this, if we accept his vision, what that has to teach us about the nature of philosophy and of the humanities more generally. One thing is that I think it puts the humanities as sister studies to the sciences, the natural sciences. This idea of beginning in wonder is something that is very common among scientists. They are in awe of the things that they study, and they persist in that awe. Figuring it out doesn't dispel their wonder. So the humanities are like the sciences in that sense, on Plato's view at least, in that we are trying to understand a reality other than us that is somehow very important and worthwhile, worth knowing. And that's the thing that sort of guides us in our practice. But the difference between the humanities and the sciences is that the humanities are somehow studying ourselves. And we see this in Plato too. Socrates refutes people, and suddenly they become strange to themselves. That they somehow hear the voice of truth in themselves, but it's other than what they thought before. And so I want to suggest that on a Platonic vision of philosophy, we're trying to understand the wonderful thing outside of us, but in that experience, we also are made strange and wonderful to ourselves. And finally, that we should not think of the humanities as generating new knowledge, right? It's not novelty that's the important thing here. It's rather that with each generation, we keep trying to see the world afresh for ourselves. And that experience of coming at it from a different angle and finding out, lo and behold, there it is again. That's what's wonderful. It's not that we've discovered a new country. It's rather that we've seen the same old country from a new perspective, and that awakens us to its value. So anyway, that's all I have sort of prepared to say to you all, but I'd be happy to take questions. Yes?
I have a two-part. First of all, it involves what you started by saying, what brought you to philosophy. What brought you to philosophy? And before you got there, how much science had you studied?
Well, I went to college convinced that I would major in English, but I'm embarrassed to say this, my parents always told me I should study philosophy. So I thought, okay, I'll take a philosophy class. And it was intro moral philosophy, and it was Kant's groundwork. That just amazed me. I thought the idea that you could really try to establish moral, in some sense moral knowledge that we share, but that you could establish it by argument, I thought was an extraordinary enterprise. So that is what first got me interested in philosophy. But I have to say, by the time I came close to graduation, I had tired of it. I had tired of the effort to sort of make arguments, and also to, what I'd really tired of was the practice of destroying the arguments of others. I thought that just seemed destructive, and where were we getting with it? Then, the second semester of my senior year, I took a course on Aristotle's Ethics, and it changed my life. I thought, this is what I've been looking for all along. This is the way ethics should be approached. And it was this feeling that I just was talking about, a sense of, in some way, this is what I've been thinking all along, and yet it seems a little weird. It was that sense of getting distance on inchoate beliefs I had already had. So that's how I got going on it, and so I had to learn Greek and then went to graduate school.
Do you think of yourself as a philosopher or an ethicist?
I think of myself as both, I think. I think of myself as a philosopher and an ethicist. But as to how much science I had, I mean, I had taken, the standard science curriculum in high school, and I was never, to my shame, I was not much of a scientist. But one of the wonderful things that's been happening at the U of C is Ann Leonard in the Smart Museum has been pairing humanists and scientists together to talk about works of art in the Smart Museum. And I took part in one of those, and it was very fruitful. So. No, I don't think so. I think it's just it's the wrong way to look at what we are doing. Anyway, modern science is still pretty new. So of course there's so much to understand that hasn't been understood yet. And building bridges, that's beside the point, right? I mean, wonderful though that is. I'm talking about pure science, just understanding how does our cosmos work. We're just at the beginning of this. I mean, try to understand quantum theory. I can't get my head around it. So it's no wonder that it should look like that. But the humanities are about, it's a collective activity of ourselves confronting ourselves. And there's really nothing new about that except that the people are new. And so that because there are new people doing it and new cultures engaged in it, then you will come to different ways of looking at, what human beings are like. But it's not, and some of those will be dead ends. I don't want to suggest that every answer each generation comes up with is as good as any other. I don't think that. But it's essentially not about trying to find a new country. It's about trying to look back into what it is like to be a human being living in society with others from a first personal perspective over and over again. Yes. I think you are right, that is something that could happen, is that you would be stunned. But the thought is that, so if you've been refuted, you recognize your own ignorance and you see that you have a lack. But you're not just in a condition of lack. I mean, just to lack, there's no way to move. But because you lack and know that you do, but your wonder allows you to see something of the answer. And that's supposed to be the thing that inspires inquiry. So it's, to take an example, at the end of the Lakeys, they are discussing the nature of courage. And they have a sense that it is knowledge. They feel like somehow knowledge is important. But every time they try to specify the way in which it's important, they come up with they are refuted in their attempts to do that. And so the thought would be that that experience of being refuted is the experience of sort of having the contours of reality made clearer to you, even though you don't yet know what the actual account is. But you have that sense of seeing something. I mean, I know, if you're trying to understand or think about some problem, sometimes you have that feeling, oh, I think you're onto something. I think you're onto something there. That's supposed to be the experience of wonder. But you are quite right that it's awesome, and you might be afraid and not be able to keep investigating. That, I think, is a big reason that Plato thinks of courage as part of the philosophical life. Something that's sort of weird to us is, kind of, you don't think of philosophers as the bravest people. But that, I think, is wise, the sense that you have to keep enduring in your effort to more perfectly see this thing that you want so much. See, this, Plato distinguishes different kinds of desire. And so some desires are rational and some aren't. But let's leave that aside, because I think there's something here even so. I worry about Aristotle's conception of wonder, that it will quickly devolve into a search for the pleasure of just finding out something, and that in a way that is unlimited and frenetic, right? And so it's that, and why does his wonder have that danger in a way that I don't think Plato's does? Well, it does because the wonder is essentially tied to pain. He talks about how people who wonder, this is Aristotle, says that people who wonder are fleeing the pain of ignorance. And so that the pleasure of wonder essentially depends on an awareness of your ignorance. But Plato's wonder isn't like that. So the thought would be, if the pleasure of wonder depends on the pain of ignorance, then you got to keep being ignorant. You're going to be sort of required to stay in ignorance so that you can keep feeling this pleasure of wonder. So one thing might be a kind of frenetic inquiry, but another possibility, I think, is sort of mystification. Right? The thought that let's keep piling on the bamboozlement, because I don't want to know. I don't really want to know. I want to feel like I'm learning. And I think that for Plato, that's not a problem. There is no limit. There is no necessary limit to the desire to know. Well, okay, so that's a great question. I think that there's a kind of excitement that happens when you discover that an argument, say from a long time ago, is leading you into the same, and made in a very different way from different premises, is leading you to basically the same thought, right? So, of course, philosophy is not the practice of just holding conclusions. It's the practice of holding conclusions for certain reasons. That's very important, right? It's not just having a bunch of thoughts. It's the reasons that matter. So those different approaches are going to be a matter of bringing different reasons to bear. But what happens when people bring different reasons to bear but come to the same conclusion, you have the sense that this is not just a figment of my imagination. I'm on to something. So that would be the nature of the progress. But I don't want to rule out that cultures change, our situation changes. When you reading Aristotle on citizenship, which I love to do, is not, you think, what does this have to do with us? Our relationship to political community is so very different than his, so that some new thoughts are going to be required there. So I don't want to rule out the thought that there entirely could be something new. It's just that what counts as success? The success is not that you found something new. What's success or progress in the humanities is that you yourself see it for yourself. That's why that's why each generation has to keep doing it. In the sciences, I think this is a debased way to think about the sciences, but let's just say that what you cared about was to take scientific knowledge and then apply it for engineering. In a way, you could just take the results and now just apply it, and you wouldn't have to keep thinking for yourself why this is the way physics works. But humanistic knowledge is something that is valuable only if you yourself understand it, right? Because it's essentially a kind of self-knowledge. And so that's the progress, is just that, yet again, we, and it's a collective enterprise, not individual, yet again, we are coming to an understanding of what virtue is for us and how we should live with each other. And how we should be related to the wider world, I should say. It's not just about human beings related to each other, but also to the environment and God, if God exists.
Yeah, from different angles.
That's right. That's right, and that's the wonderful thing about it. You might be a lover of multiplicity for its own sake,
right.
But Plato is a lover of the fact that despite our multiplicity, we actually are seeing the same thing. And that is, I share this. It is a wonderful thing if we actually succeed in communicating, right? It's not just my own point of view. It's not just an illusion, but the fact that the way I see something is consistent, not necessarily the same, but consistent with the way you see it, is reason to think that we really are seeing something and not just making it up. So the Greek word for contemplation is theoria, and it comes from the verb theorein, which means to be a spectator. So Aristotle is talking about being a spectator of reality, being a spectator of what you already know. It's not the life of inquiry and discovery. It's the life of looking at what you know. And my thought is that just seems so, well, okay, great, it's good to know things, but isn't it more fun to learn? I think that's a feeling that a lot of us have. And that is what I like about Plato, is that he's saying that both inquiry and contemplating what you already know are both theoria. They are both a case of looking, right? And the pleasure in them is the same. And I have to say, I actually think that Aristotle, in his heart, believes this too. I've set up a contrast between them, but I think part of the reason that Aristotle thinks of thauma as just mere curiosity is that by the time Aristotle is writing, thauma has become cheapened in the Greek language. That there is a practice of trying to create effects of wonder as a kind of illusion. That's why he talks about the marionettes, right? And that is not the end of human life, to be that kind of delight and, ooh, cool, look how that works, right? So I think part of the reason that it looks as if Aristotle and Plato disagree is that the terminology has shifted its meaning.
Would Plato have used the term contemplate too to be the problem solving, or would you've used another word?
He uses, he does use theorein, and he also uses, I didn't write the Greek here, and I didn't bring it with me, but in number 3 on your handout, where Socrates, he's speaking in the voice of the wise diatema. That's why he addresses himself. he says that here, if anywhere, my dear Socrates, it is that life is worth living for a human being in contemplation of beauty itself. So he also thinks that it's looking. But Plato doesn't think the task of trying to bring it more clearly into view is ever done, right? So keep on looking. That would be the Platonic move, right? And it's interesting that you bring this up, because actually the Theaetetus, this moment in the Theaetetus occurs when they are discussing Protagorean relativism, right? And it's part of the point is to see that Theaetetus is not the kind of guy who's content with seeing that, hey, things appear in conflicting ways. No, it makes him wonder, right? He wants to get to the bottom of it. So it is a move, in that dialogue, you are quite right that it's a move against relativism to think of wonder this way. I confess that my own inclinations are in that direction too. I am sort of a Platonist, but I don't think that if you don't share those metaphysical presuppositions, then you have to throw out everything here. Because remember, there's a dialectic between Plato and Homer about what wonder is. They both agree that to wonder is to be sort of paradoxically aware that the divine is present to you as a mortal. And divine here just means, instead of for Plato, divine is going to be translated into fundamental principles of reality, right? So it's the real, the really real is the divine. But then I also said that Homer thinks that the really real, the really divine is multifarious. Plato says, no, it can't be that way. The really real, the divine, is one. And the history of Western philosophy has dominantly been that Platonic story. But there is also this other story that, that really ontology is very different. And you might try to spell that out. And you could still think, you could take a more sort of Homeric vision of wonder. However, I think that there would be a challenge for you, and it's a challenge for all of us, right, is that you've got to distinguish sophistical wonder working from genuine philosophical awe. So you don't want it to be a kind of illusory, feeling good and mystified. Right? That is useless. That's not knowing. So the sort of marks by which you would distinguish the sort of genuine encounter with a multiple reality from a sophistical, whatever that's going to look like, is something you would have to work out. And it would be different from what Plato says. Well, thank you for, I have read other things by him, but I haven't read that. That's...
Could you repeat that?
Feynman, Richard Feynman was a physicist, The Pleasure of Finding Things Out. I think there's so much room for disagreement in everything that I've said. So much room for disagreement about, well, what is really valuable about the object of study, and what the object of study is like. Is it unified or diverse? There's lots of room for difference, but I do think that this is a place the sciences and the humanities should come together, though I must say that I don't think that the humanists always fully are aware of that. And I think that's partly because they are very conscious of the ways in which the sort of stories of awe have been self-serving illusions. And so they sometimes think that the point is to try to shatter the illusion. And I just want to say, well, no, that's a danger. That's a danger when the thing you're trying to understand is yourself, that you're going to misunderstand yourself. But we shouldn't, for that reason, give up on the project of trying to encounter something genuinely valuable, and think of ourselves as doing that primarily. So thank you all very much. These are great questions.